Welcome back and welcome to the channel if you're new. My name's Will and I'm a Houdini artist, currently working full-time freelance and also teaching a paid Houdini course, Level Up Houdini. And this is a sample project from that program, and it is a full Heightfield environment introduction. So this is exactly actually what we're creating here today. And instead of actually creating it all from scratch here, we're going to be doing a high-level overview, so kind of a node by node, or more so a section by section breakdown of the general workflow. And if you are interested in learning more specifics about how this was set up, and if you want to learn how to set up similar environments for your own projects, you can check out the program here. But we'll keep this short and more so focused on the workflows and the techniques that you need to put together to create an environment like this. So this was one environment here, so one main Heightfield, and then to show off a little bit, I did I think maybe it was 5 or 6 different camera angles. So I wanted a little bit of a cinematic to show off some different parts of the environment. This one actually is probably my favorite. But to get some practice into how to set these all up and to get a cool result. So in today's video, I'm going to break it down into a few sections so it's nice and tidy for the chapters, but feel free to actually download these project files. They are free in the description, and you're welcome to learn with them, use them for whatever. And if you do have questions, let me know. But hopefully you'll get a lot out of this video, and hopefully you'll get a really cool environment if you try to explore or set something up similar to this. So that's gonna be all for this intro. I'll be back with a quick introduction to the next section and we'll get moving. Welcome back and welcome to the overview section of this Heightfield project. So in this one, I'll go really quick over a quick breakdown of the whole workflow, and then we'll have a couple sections after this to go into a little bit more detail. But this workflow is a very standard Heightfield workflow. I've got just my base Heightfield and this torus here. And by combining those two with a little bit more detail here, we can get a nice base shape that will be our volcano. And then after all of these nodes down here, I'll go all the way to the end, and we will go through these in a little bit more detail in the next section. But we can see I've got a nice Heightfield here. And I've actually disabled a node right here, which is a Heightfield resample. Currently, my Heightfield resolution is 500 by 500 in this final render. And actually in all these final renders, I used 2000 by 2000 for my Heightfield resolution. So if you want to have the same resolution, you can enable this node. But to make it a little more friendly on your computer to download, I did disable that. And then on this cache here, I've got a cached version of that 2000 by 2000 resolution Heightfield. And we can see all of the Heightfield layers that we have created up here. So this is partially from some of the Heightfield nodes. And then a couple of these were actually created manually by layering and blending different Heightfield layers to get control over different parts of the environment. So then once we get our Heightfield, which is still cached as a Heightfield, so it's not yet geometry, I go into this HF to COPS node. And what I do is I import this Heightfield. So SOP import, export it here, or from geo to layer, which is how we work with Heightfields in COPS. And then the main thing I did here is I created these masks, which are mostly the default masks. So if I go here to this input node, select it, on this composite view down here, we can see all these masks that came in from Heightfield, or came in from our Heightfield. So what I did was I combined a couple of these. Maybe I took curvature and slump or ridge and created some Boolean operations of multiplying, adjusting, adding some noises, remapping, and that gave me masks that I would use for where I wanted my grass, where I wanted my sand, which was down here, where I wanted a different actual type of sand, and then the rocks that I was going to be using for my main volcano cliffs. And then I did export all of those with ROP image outputs. And then here I can preview what I've got here. And then this colorized material was this out color node, and that is most of the rest of this network, but that's actually not used in the render. This was just to get a preview in my scene view and see what it might look like. Because I redid this all with, instead of different colors, I actually blended materials inside of this LOP network in Karma, and I created one big material that was for both the landscape and for the rocks. But now I can see my grass mask on this environment, and these are just referencing the COP nodes. And we're not going to go into detail here. If you are interested in learning this all in detail, then definitely check out the program Level Up Houdini, because we do cover everything you need to know to do this from scratch. But then we've got the ridge mask, we've got the sand mask, and we can even see some nice detail in this Heightfield, and then a slump mask, which is for the other type of sand that I was adding to the project. And then on this left side here, so this is the actual Heightfield, and I do a couple things, but first I convert it to geometry, and then I want to be able to have control over the displacement of the rocks and the ground separately. So what I do is I use the mask ridge, which I had created up here, and I'm splitting or clipping here based on this mask. So on the left side, I'm going to disable this color. I get one of my objects, which should be the ridge. And then on the right side, I get my ground. And then this little section of nodes here, I used it to create a edge mask, which in this case is named no edge. I'm transferring no edge here, but this is how I mask my displacement. So if I look at this side here on both of these, because these meshes are actually cut in the middle, so right here along this line, I didn't want to have any displacement here because that would cause a little bit of an artifact or a glitch. Not really a glitch, but it would separate these meshes from each other. So having this mask let me limit that to 0 displacement. And then I do a little bit of instancing prep for some rocks, and then a little bit of instancing prep for some of my grass. And then on the left here, I've actually created a rock, which is very simple and oriented along the z-axis, because that's how we instance in Solaris. The positive z-axis is what axis is facing on our normals when we instance to a points. And then on this one, actually, this is a procedural grass setup, and this is actually part of a different project inside Level Up Houdini, but I've copied and pasted that into this one just to save a little bit of time. And now we can see a nice procedural grass setup that is instanced along, or oriented along, the positive z direction. And then inside my LOP network, I've got a nice basic setup, which should be familiar to you if you've seen some of the videos on this channel. And here we go. Our environment setup in LOPs. The main way this works is I import my geo, so my ridge and my ground separately, and I do control the dicing settings individually on these here. Whoops. And this does let me get a little bit extra detail in the displacement for the rocks, and I don't necessarily need to have that for my ground. I then create one material for the ground. If I jump inside here, which is just this ground grass, and then one for the single rock that I instance, and then one for the single patch of grass that I instance, and then I assign that to both the ground and the ridge. Next up here, I've got two instancing setups. So I'm instancing my rock onto the points, which I've just used to fetch these points from the other part of my geometry context in this area down here. So these points we had created here. And then I do the same thing for rocks and the same thing for grass. And we can see all my nice grass blades here. And then the materials are assigned to the rocks and the grass. Lighting setup here. So I've done an HDRI and 2 area lights, graphed those in. And then my nice camera setups with a cache down here to get some motion blur. So if I go down here to the end, I've got all 7 of my Karma render settings nodes, which are both selecting the cameras and setting a couple AOVs, as well as the file output path, and then a USD render ROP with a ROPNet that batches all of those together. So with one click down here, I can render everything. And then a slap comp to put together. And this looks like actually is visible. And we do have all of this animated, which is really cool. So this slap comp didn't do too much, but I added a little bit of haze, some nice chromatic aberration, and a little bit of distortion to give it a really cool style that I liked a lot. If I hit U to go up, go to my end, and maybe select Cliff Zoom 2, which was actually my favorite camera. I can make sure I'm in aces, and then I can do a quick preview to see what it looks like. But this is it's a full project. And a lot of fun to make. Once this finishes up, we'll do a quick overview of a little bit more detail, how it was actually set up. But if you are interested in going node by node and a really, really deep dive of everything explained, and again, learning how to set these all up yourself, then I definitely recommend you check out Level Up Houdini. There currently is not many released projects because it's all kind of inside the program, but now that we've done most of the lessons, we are creating some really cool projects. So this is going to be one of these that I will be sharing to hopefully get some more artists into the program. But here we go. Looks pretty good. I really do like this one a lot. I think there's some nice detail in the composition and the grounds and the rocks. It's definitely my favorite. And then we have a couple other ones here too. And now we can see this nice motion blur that we get because we've got this cache node and then some animation across our 120 frames. So awesome. I'm going to give that a pause. And then I think that's going to be the end of the intro section, and we'll come back to do a little bit more in depth on some of the Heightfield. Welcome back, and welcome to the Heightfield overview. In this section, we're going to look a little bit more in detail about how this Heightfield was actually set up. But again, definitely do download the files. And if you do want to learn all of this Heightfield stuff from scratch, you can take a look at the program. But what I've got here is a base Heightfield. I've done 2 Heightfield noises just to add a little bit of variation. So I wanted to get these ridges here and then some nice small details just to give me a nice base to start working with. And then I created a torus, which is the main driving shape for the actual volcano shape. And then I've done a mask here because I wanted to get both the mask and project the geometry up here. And then this is actually going to be a little bit modified. So I expand the mask. I copy the layer to ridge, which is part of the workflow that I use way down here in the CopNet setups. I want to make sure I'm having certain layers that I can use to combine and do my materials with. So I remove this mask because now it's been copied to ridge. I no longer need to have it stored in my mask layer. A little bit of a Heightfield distort to shuffle some of these around. And then again, I'm not going to go into detail on what these nodes do, I just want to showcase the workflow of them applied. Do a mask to get some steep areas because I want to be able to expand and smooth the edges of this volcano a little bit. And then I expand it and then smooth that down, which creates a little bit more of a slant here. And also actually gives me a nice ridge on top, which I then expand the height. So rather than using a mask expand to expand the actual mask, this is pushing the sides out, and it gave me a little bit of a cool ridge at the top that worked well with the Heightfield erode. So I distort, add a little bit more. And the nice thing about this one is I'm distorting both the mask and the geometry, and the Heightfield. So then this mask is actually going to be placed into the same position as the height. If I don't distort the mask will stay static. But to make sure it matches the same noise applied to the Heightfield, I can just distort that mask as well. And then I invert it and I erode. And I want to erode the areas around here. And I do have this erodibility mask set to mask. So I've got a little bit of a nice erosion, and I'm still getting it on both of these areas. I then invert it again, expand it a little bit more, blur the mask, copying this into the new ridge mask. So I want to make sure I'm updating this as I'm working. Distorting just this ridge because I want to add some more detail to just the Heightfield area here. Invert it. And then copy this to ground because I'm going to be using this in my shading partially as well. And then removing that because this mask has now been copied into my ground layer. And then this one down here was a Heightfield resample to increase the resolution from 500 to 2000. I'm going to leave it off for now. But if you are working and want to get the same quality I did in the final Heightfield, you can enable that. And then what I wanted to do was add a little bit more detail. And actually, maybe I should enable this because without this resolution, we are not going to see exactly how these next nodes are working. So I wanted to get a base shape here for the main Heightfield before I started adding in all this extra detail. And then I distort again using my ridge mask. And then I'm copying back from the ridge layer I had saved up here into my mask channel. So you don't always have to store it in your mask channel. You can modify those as you work and do the same thing for the ground. And then another distort just so I had the flexibility to add different distortions to each of those. And this is already looking pretty cool, but we are going to keep going. I wanted to make a slump mask here because I wanted to have this environment as a older volcano. Maybe it used to be rocky, and then there was some sediment and debris build up, So this is starting to create some of that look. We can see I've got some nice sediment and kind of dirt patches and sand filling up these cracks. And then I do another layer of erosion, bring back the mask, and then I remap this because I want to have a different amount of this mask actually being used to control the erode. And there we go. So this is a lot of erosion on this actual mountain itself. And again, I'm not going to go through all these details, but again, you can download these files and take a look at them yourself if you'd like to go node by node. And then I do a little bit of math and Boolean operations, which is really just combining some volumes or some layers because I want to make sure I am now getting this, but removing the sediment layer. Because before, this ridge was the old ridge, but because this new Heightfield erode had added in these little patches and crevices of sand, I want to make sure those are removed from my mask. So I will not be shading those as rock. Those are going to stay as the nice, dirty, maybe rough sand. Same thing done again, shuffling some of these layers, sediment to mask. And now just adding some additional distortion only to the rock layers. So I was using the sediment and then inverting that one, because otherwise I would be just distorting on the sediment. But I want it everywhere there's no sediment, which is going to be my rocky area. Clear that out, and then I can preview again to make sure I didn't have any accidental mess ups with my mask. Copy this again, sediment to mask to use it again, and then eroding a little bit. And then these remaps, sometimes I don't want to have it either on or off for the Heightfield erode. I want to have maybe not as much erosion. So I can remap a mask and then feed that in here. If it loads, it's still cooking. Then I can control how much of the Heightfield is eroded. So here, this erodibility mask lets me remap to say only erode certain parts, certain amounts, and then maybe 100% erosion can be on the sediment and only 20% can be on the rest of the rocks. And this gives some nice detail. We can see before it's nice and smooth, but after we do get all these nice erosion trails of the sand kind of falling down and flowing. And I'd set the erosion feature size to be smaller in order to do that. And that will get clamped if you go too small. Remove the mask, do a little bit more slumping. And this here, I wanted to add this sediment buildup inside these cracks. So by grouping the mask here on the steep areas, I was able to get a little more slump there. I then copy the mask to slump and then delete it. Because if I just clear these layers, I'd lose them all, but I want to make sure I am still keeping them. Again, removing and updating this to make sure my ridge mask is properly up to date, because I want to be using this later for splitting my geometry for the displacement quality, and then also for shading. And then these are not modifying the masks, but they are going to be what Heightfield from feature or mask from feature to get some curvature. I save that occlusion, which is going to give me some nice areas for my grass patches. Save that and then clear that mask again. Then I'm remapping the sediment layer. And I'm remapping some of these so the values can be more normalized between 0 and 1 when I start to work with these in COPs. Because if these sediment layers are not normalized, they might be a little bit more tricky to work with. And then again, making sure this ridge mask is updated. Remapping in a little bit to get a cleaner line on this cut, because I do split by this mask to actually create those two parts of geometry that I import into Solaris. And then remapping or saving, this to Rocky Ridge and clearing that out. And then I've got my cached Heightfield. So a lot of this work is pretty standard. I think it took me about maybe an hour to set up most of this stuff, and then a little bit of time to clean it up, modify, and dial it in for exactly what I want. But if you are interested in getting more detail or understanding how all these nodes work, then either download the files and do that, or you can check out the program again. There's lots of information there. So awesome. That is the end of the Heightfield section. The next section, we take all this information here and we're going to process those a little bit. One more quick cool node. If you do visualize Heightfield, so HF visualize, you can preview some of these. We'll let it load, but you can load in your individual layers and take a look at the colors here instead of having to go through COPs. So COPs is really nice when you want to be exporting that to an image, because then you can nicely set that up in your render of choice. But awesome. That's going to be all for the Heightfield section. We'll come back, it looks like, in the Heightfield processing section in COPs and learn some more. So I'll see you in the next section. Welcome back. and welcome to the Heightfield processing section for cops. So the end result of what we had the last section was a bunch of masks from our Heightfield, and the result of what we want to have for this section are these masks here, which we are using in our shading later. So I've got a sand mask, a slump mask, the ridge mask, which is the rocks, and then a grass mask. And then also this colorized material, which I'm actually not using in the final project because I rebuilt a similar setup from scratch in my materials. But the cop network we use for this one is this one here on the left. If you'd like to, you can create a similar setup in this one on the right. If I jump inside here, and a trick actually is if I hit U to go up, if I jump in, I'm going to lose this height field here. It's going to switch to my compositing view, but I can pin this one, and now that will stay on this colorized material. So even though I jump in, this out color node is still being fetched on that colorized material. And then these nodes are referenced in my UV quick shades. But all I do here is I import my SOP, which is the height field to cops. If I hit U to go up, it is this node right here. Geo to layer, which is splitting this out into all the height field layers that I can then combine and use however I need. I probably could have removed some of these that I didn't need, but I left them because I might want the flexibility later. This main setup here on the top is what is creating this colored version, but we're really only going to focus on the grass. Maybe I'll make some more space here. The sand, the slump, and the ridge rocks. And those are really just done by modifying these here. So maybe my height, which I did have to equalize, but debris, sediment, flow I did use, slump I did use, curvature, and occlusion. And then I just messed with these, combined them a little bit to get maybe, if this was the grass, then I didn't want grass on the top of the mountain. So maybe I removed grass on the top of the mountain, and then I didn't want different areas to be certain colors. So I was able to use these and get exactly what I wanted to do for my materials. And a similar idea, again, I'm not going to go node by node just because that would take a very long time. And I want to showcase more so the workflow here. And this was partially to blend some of the coloring for the sand, which is layered in here. But most of this stuff isn't actually needed. So probably only a quarter of these nodes I do need, and that was really getting these set up for the shading. So this is the ridge layer here, and then I wanted to remove and clean up some of the sediment. And some of these I was unsure of how I was going to actually shade it. So I wanted to make sure I had enough flexibility in these masks to design some cool setups. And I probably could have done a little bit more with this slump mask because this, I really do like these trails here. And you can sort of see them, but in the final render, it's a little too rocky to see those. So I probably could have improved the look there by bringing those out a little bit more. But that is something we can always improve on. I feel like most projects, there's always ways to make them look better. So it's really just fundamentals here, nothing too crazy and nothing super fancy. And then we export the cop paths. So we're using a ROP image output to save these to disks. And I do not like using these nodes. So these are not cached currently. They are recomputed and recooked. But when we are rendering, I like to reference images. I find it's more stable and less likely to have any issues. And then these nodes down here are the preview of these masks. And to reference one of these, all we do is we select the node path we actually want to use. So this grass mask here would be out mask grass. I can Control C, you to go up, my UV quick shade, paste it, and now this is the path to the node. But in order to make this actually register and tell Houdini that it's not an image, we need to do OP colon. And now that will evaluate this and give me an image here, which is really cool because if I click to open this, it would open up my file browser. And I've got a little description for what these are. And then again, I'm not using the colorized material in the final render. So awesome. That is going to be all for this cop section. I definitely go through here if you're curious on how this is set up. Probably could have organized it a little bit better, but this was just a quick example project. So we're not going to worry too much about that. But awesome. That's going to be all for the compositing processing, and I'll be back in the next section. Welcome back, and welcome to the LOPS layout section. In this section, I'm going to give you a quick overview on a little bit more detail, the actual LOP setup, and then we will actually quickly cover this processing I had done for the mesh because I did want to import these as separate objects. So right here, I've got my HF to COPS, which is the result of my Heightfield. I convert that using just my Heightfield convert node. And then what I'm doing is I am splitting based on this ridge attribute. So this ridge is the color, or this color is the ridge attribute I had created. We can actually still visualize it down here from my COP network. But I wanted to have control over these areas separate. So the blue, I could have displaced rock with a little bit higher dicing or higher tessellation, which is just more resolution in my render time displacement. So I clip those, create a group because I'm going to merge those back, cache them, and then split them out. So these groups let me combine and then separate the geometry. I'm setting an edge attribute, transferring a different edge attribute. So this is 1 on the left and 0 on the right. And the right is my ground. And the reason I did this was because I am using displacement and because these meshes are not connected. If they are, I did the same exact thing, but opposite on this side. And then I remapped this to flip it from 0 to 1. So now I can see the blue areas are going to get full displacement with no edge. And then the red areas are 0. So when I multiply this value against my displacement value, there will be no displacement along those cracks. And that's going to give me a nice, smooth, and seamless transition between the base of my ground and then the actual Heightfield itself. And actually this area here, you can see there's no artifacts, which is why this trick is really cool. And I've got one on the left and one on the right. And then these two nodes, out geo ridge and out geo ground, are being referenced inside here. And this one here, start, I've got my primitive. This is pinned at the top from the previous section of the video. So if I unpin this and set it to 1, I'll now jump into Solaris, which looks like it is rendering. So I'll switch it back to my viewport and resume the render. And there we go. Now we're back in Solaris, but I've got my primitives defining the organization for how I want to split out my geometry spreadsheet. I've got the ground being imported here. And then I've got the ridge being imported. And then these render geometry settings are setting the dicing quality on these ones here. And perhaps I could have explicitly defined the primitives because I'm not a fan of using these expressions. Merge those together, graft those into my landscape primitive here using similar techniques I've taught before on this channel. And then this is the material section. So I've got a nice material library, and I will quickly dive into this because this is maybe where it fits. So I hit U to go up. I can see I'm creating these 3 materials, bringing them into my stage, my Solaris context, merging those, actually grafting those with my branches, or with the graph branches into my scene, and then assigning those. But these are really simple. For this rock, it is just a standard rock material. So I'm using textures that should be included with the project files. And if you're curious on how to set this up, definitely take a look at the material lesson, on this channel, because we cover materials in a lot more detail than this. So I'm not going to go into those in this video. The grass is very similar, but I just used a rest node on, or rather a rest position, which is also something we've covered in the environment course when we were adding variation for the instanced props there. But I was using the rest position, feeding that into a noise, and then using that noise to drive the color. So some of these are going to be darker green. Some of these are going to be a little yellowish green for the main color. And then because they were so small, I just did a roughness and a base color, and that was all. So no fancy materials, no individual blade textures here. This was just very, very simple. The ground grass is this main material that was assigned to both the rocks and the ground itself. And this one is a little bit more complex, but still probably a little bit less complex than we have done in the material sections. So I've got mostly, the main thing is this one here, which is the masks I had created in cups. So I'm loading in my grass mask, I'm loading in my sand mask, loading in my slump dirt mask, and I am using those to blend between 4 different textures. So I've got here base color is this top stream. Specular roughness is this one here. So all of these go to base color, all of these go to specular roughness, all of these go to the normal maps, normal channel, and then all of these go down to the displacement. And then here is where I read in that no edge, which was that red and blue value I had created on this mountain, multiply that by 2 just to give it a little more displacement, and that goes into my scale. So there'll be 0 displacement on the seams between those 2 meshes. And then these are all standard materials. So just tiled image. I'm using UVs because Heightfields generate UVs for us. Adding a little bit of noise, a little bit of variation. And then very simple setup with my roughness, normal, same thing again. And then displacement. And I've done a reference copy for these here, and they're referencing this grass tiling. So if I right click, actions, create reference copy, what that's going to do is it's going to save the same value here, which I'm plugging into the UV tiling, because our UVs are really big for this environment because it's a giant Heightfield. I need to scale down my textures to be a little more appropriately sized. But now as I change this value, the grass is always going to have the same tiling for its roughness channel, its normal, its displacement, and its diffuse. And then the sand is very similar as well. Dirt, very similar. And then this one all the way on the left is just another base dirt material, which I think actually this one might be, I think this is rock. So not base dirt. This is base rock. So this is the main rock. And then my idea was that this is a rocky environment. So the rocks should be the base material. And then the other materials are layered on top. And then the order I had done to layer these would have affected the result of my materials. So these grass masks to sand to slump dirt, depending on how I blend these on top, I might get a little bit different result because these are not all necessarily unique. So some grass mask might overlap some sand mask, and it actually does. If I go, well, I'll show you really quick. Up one more time. And I can see grass mask here. So we can see there is grass everywhere, even in these valleys. So even on these bottom sides. And there's also sand. So to do the grass, I did grass first and then sand on top because I didn't want to have any grass in the middle. And in this case, actually, you can see there is grass here. But if I jump back inside my LOP network, there is no grass. Or there is grass, but not necessarily in the middle here. Next up, I had my space G to frame. Zoom all the way in. And it's giving me that really wide view because I have a camera, I believe, selected down there. But this is my only rock I instanced. Just a cube. And I want to just get a little more variation in some of the height silhouettes as I'm moving. And I think you can actually do a lot of work with a very simple object. So this one cube is instanced to every single rock. And then this is, whoops, I zoom all the way back in. All right, for some reason it's not letting me zoom in. And we can see my grass here. And this is oriented along the z-axis because when I instance onto these points here, I've got the grass. I scaled it up a little bit. When I instance onto these points, which were fetched from SOPs, we can see all these points. They do have normals pointing in the upwards direction, and the normals are actually aligned with the ground itself. So I hit U to go up. That is how I set these up. I assigned the same materials I had created up here, and then the lighting is very similar with background. So a dome light, and then 2 area lights. And if I go down all the way to the bottom here, and maybe go to Hero Cam wide. If I do a quick render, and this is after my Karma render settings because I've set LPE tags for the render layers. So every light is going to be saved to its own layer. We'll quickly see the lighting, and then I'll do one quick cover of the instancing. So we can see the render outputs. I've got my color. Looks like it is not a fan of me recording while rendering. So maybe I'll pause the render. And we can see I've got my background HDRI. I've got a rim light. Sky HDRI. And then this is the key light. So this was kind of the main light I had used. And then the rim light looks like it just had a little bit of additional detail coming from this side. And then a depth map, because I did add a little bit of haze to the environment. So I switch this back to C for my beauty render. And for here, I will show the scattering, but this is just the lighting down here. Cameras are very standard. So there are 7 cameras. There is animation on each of those. So if I disable my render, go back to Vulkan, we can see there's some nice animation across the environments. And then I did a cache for some motion blur. Render settings, I enabled motion blur, set some filters for denoising, and then added a ACES CG output for color space for all of these, a split per LPE tag for beauty, and then my USD render ROPs for my frame range, Karma XPU, and my batch rendering. So pretty standard, pretty fun, and very cool. And for that instancing setup, I had just read in the masks. So disable my normal previews. This is the sand mask, I believe. Mask sand EXR, which I had created up here. I remapped the color a little bit. I set this color to density, and then I scatter based on this density attribute. So I am only getting points in the areas where I want to have these rocks. Randomize some p-scale, randomize some p-scale again, and then randomize my up vector to randomly orient these rocks. And then the important thing to note is the normals were computed on the points. So by default, the instancing is going to inherit a point normal. If you do this on the vertices, you might have to double check your geometry spreadsheet to make sure you have your normals, but they might not be inherited. And then perhaps I could have cleaned up some of these other attributes because I don't need those when rendering, but for now, this is a fine setup. And a very similar thing here on the right, actually exactly similar, except I did add a rest node because I was using a world projected noise to add some randomization to the coloring of these, and then the rock was all the same color. And this was a single rock, so just 2 boxes, space F to frame. I did a Boolean to merge them together, and then bevel to add some roundness, UV, and then a little bit of displacement with my mountain. And then this one on the left is a circle, and this was a procedural grass tool we had set up in a boss battle inside Level Up Houdini, but I create a base patch of curves or blades of grass, and then in the original project this was used as a source for about 7 or 8 different plants, but this is right now connected here, and then the output result is these geometries here. So I won't go through this whole thing because it is pretty standard, but definitely download and ask questions if you have any. And if you actually would like to have this created from scratch and a lot more information here, you can check out the program where I am able to help you in some more detail creating these really cool environments. So that's going to be the end of the layout section. I'll come back and actually did the materials in this layout. I was planning on originally having those as 2 separate sections, but that's going to be all, and I'll be back with a quick touch onto the final compositing. Welcome back, and welcome to the final compositing section. So if I jump inside my lot network, what I've got here is 7 of my camera angles, all nice and set up with my USD render ops, and then this single fetch that will render everything when I click render. If I hit U, to do the slap comps, I've actually set those up inside this comp network right here. And if I jump inside that one, there's 2 blocks here. A slap comp block up here lets you do compositing on the image without it being cached to disk, which is really helpful. So if I go here, I have selected my camera. I'm going to enable Karma XPU, and I might even be able to leave it here because it is already rendered. If I jump inside my slap comp and enable a composite view, which I could do new paint type viewers, composite view here, and then see it and switch it to ACES, we can now see my slap comp import. And this is actually live from my rendering. So this is not cached to disk. This bottom one down here is cached to disk, and I'm using a file node to reference that. But same setup here for these two is actually exactly the same setup. Mostly all that's done is the depth map here was used. I remapped it, re-ramped it, and then added a little bit of a blur to give some nice haze to the back. Modified a little bit the color to make it a little more dramatic. Added a vignette. Added a tiny bit of chromatic aberration. Probably actually too much chromatic aberration, but I thought it looked cool. And then blur it, and then a sharpen again. And there's really no correct way to do this compositing. I think this looked kind of cool. And then the blurring and sharpening helped remove a little bit of the denoising artifacts that I had and made it look a little more natural, at least in my opinion. So that was the end of the slap comp. And what I can do actually, if I do a HSV adjust, I'm going to set this really big. So a very, very bold shift in the coloring. Because what I can do is I hit U to go up and go back to my scene view. When you have slap comp set up, you are able to preview those live on a render. So I could click the slap comp button and nothing's going to happen. But if I hold this down and select my out slap comp, which is inside here, out slap comp, I can preview this on my render in real time. So I could move this around, and maybe I won't move it around, but I will go to a different camera and I will restart my render. But this slap comp is really cool, so you can see what it might look like if you are compositing and you don't have to render at all. You can do a single frame and then save that out. Or not even save that out, but you can practice your compositing from there. And this shot actually did not make it into the final edit. Unfortunately, it was a cool shot, but I think it didn't match the cinematic style. This was kind of an FPV shot flying over the environment, which did look really cool, but wasn't as dramatic as I wanted. And there we go. We are getting some really nice motion blur, which I'm a big fan of. So normally is not this slow because I am rendering and recording, and I believe I actually have Nuke and Resolve open in the background. It is struggling just a little bit. So maybe I'll pause this render here. And it looks like it did refresh to the other camera. There we go. And if I pin this, what I could do is jump back inside my slap comp, disable this HSV, and we will see it does update live, which is very cool. So lots of cool stuff we can do here. Same stuff. I did a preview comp, and this was actually reading in the file here from disk. So if I switch this to a different one, maybe I want my cliff zoom 2, and I will do show sequences as one entry, so it brings it in as an animated sequence, and we can now see This bottom one is that cliff shot. And if I go down to the end, you can see the result of the little bit of compositing that I did. And there's actually a really cool project coming later to level up Houdini that is going to feature this shot. So many, many more exciting things to come. But awesome. I think that is all, actually. So that's the end of this workflow. Do download the project files. Do ask questions. The overview and the details of setting these all up from scratch is covered more in depth in Level Up Houdini, and that is something I am really excited to now have officially in the program. So some really cool Heightfield stuff, lots more projects coming, and if you do want to learn Houdini and really everything you need to know to create these projects from scratch, it is all in the program and it is all ready for you to get started. So awesome. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the files, the project, and definitely leave a like and subscribe if you are interested in learning more Houdini. So that's going to be all, and I'll see you in the next video.